Okay, now it's working.
Now
Okay.
it's working, right? And I share my screen, and you shout out if you have a problem. All right. Can you see that?
I see, I see.
Okay, great. I'll put it like this. Okay. All right. So we are talking about the new forms of monasticism and communitarian life expressing itself in a very special way of spirituality. And as I said, it's an presentation, or it's a lecture in English, but you, as we spoke, you have the Italian version of the manuscript as well, although there will be some more points I may be adding while going through the manuscript to help you, because the last term I have learned that you people at Lateran University are not too familiar with Reformation and the Reformation era. So I thought maybe in between I may explain one or two little things concerning Reformation theology, just as we walk by. We do this and then have a look at the results that can be drawn for the communitarian life there. So we are basically walking into this early modern period of Europe. And the early modern period of Europe is about 1500 to 1800, but we will mostly be addressing the time of the 16th and the 17th century, putting up a Lutheran and evangelical perspective to this. So we are basically working on the age of Reformation. And by the time we continue in our lecture, we will move on to the 17th century. And then nearly at the end, we're going to have a huge jump right into the 20th century. So this just to give you an impression of the time given. And we are dealing with various confessions and churches. I know that from a Catholic perspective, the Lutherans are not in all cases regarded as a church, but I do in this lecture because I'm referring to the Lutheran understanding itself. And Lutherans do understand themselves as church and as a confession, as well as the Reformed do, the Calvinists do, those people who came from Zurich and those people who came from Geneva, addressing another confession, a very different confession. So basically we are talking about the Lutheran confession and the Reformed confession here, addressing these new forms of life that came up throughout the 16th centuries. And these forms, which try to live up to a very new ideal between Lutheran orthodoxy and pietistic understandings of individual religiosity, these were the ones who sort of shaped the understanding of communio, of communitarian forms, of even a new monasticism. And the fact that we are hopping over to the 20th century at the end of all these lectures is due to the reason that in the 20th century, even in Lutheran church, monastic forms came up. Like the community I'm living in is actually an evangelical order. It's a Lutheran order. And of course, when we're coming from the age of Reformation, we know that Martin Luther was not so much into orders and monasteries and so forth. However, throughout the 20th century, mostly after the Second World War, even in Lutheran church, monastic life came up again, and the church had a huge dispute about the fact whether they should allow it or not, and we will dig deeper into that by the end of the lectures, finding out that Luther was not so much into, arguing against monasteries, but rather arguing against the vows and the question how free you actually were in taking the vows. Is it a voluntary choice, or are you forced to take it? And if it's a voluntary choice, then even in the Lutheran church, monasteries could exist. That's the basic idea.
Can I ask how many years are you in this community?
Yes, we are about 100
Ah,
sisters
okay.
and brothers, and we started
Wow.
off after the Second World War with, I think, about 20. And in my community, is the largest one in Germany. And
Wow.
in the peak times, there were about 180 sisters and brothers. And all together in Germany right now, we've got about, if you collect all the monasteries, the Lutheran monasteries we have about 400 people all over Germany.
Oh, wow.
So
A
compared
lot of
to
people.
Catholic orders, it's tiny one, very tiny. But well, at least it's in the Lutheran Church.
Okay.
Okay. Now you know. So how are we going to do this during this lecture? We are talking about, of course, the denial of monasticism, and therefore about the denial that goes along. It doesn't move on here. Here we go. That the denial of monasticism that goes along with the age of Reformation, and therefore with the denial of a very specific form of communitarian life. That means, as I said before, our first lecture, or after, understanding communitarian life and so forth, will deal with the Reformation era and will deal with Martin Luther and his encounters to monasticism. And we are doing this, as I said before, because his ideas of communitarian or even monastic life need to be understood properly before we judge all the other forms of communitarian life that came up throughout the Lutheran Church or the evangelical church. So the first chapter will address Luther's thinking concerning monasteries, concerning vows, and the issue of escaping from monasteries, fleeing from monastery, which was quite common and popular throughout the early 16th century. And then we, as I said, right at the end, we move on the 20th century. Secondly, we will take a close look at his very new understanding of communio, which includes his understanding of communio sanctorum. This might not sound new to you coming from a Catholic background, but still the term communio sanctorum needs to be applied and adopted in you. And here it becomes clear that understanding of new communitarian traces within the early modern period might not be complete if we left out the movements which in the so-called radical Reformation. So we will take a close look at the Radical Reformation and what is the Radical Reformation, just to give you an idea of this before we in chapter 2, we're digging deeper into this. Here we have people like the Anabaptists or the spiritualists who found their own ways and their own forms of communitarian life. They have a very, very specific and typical understanding of communio, and Anabaptists already shows us that it has to do something with baptism. In fact, these are the people who deny the children's baptism and say, in fact, if you want to become part of a new communio, you have to understand what kind of communio you're actually getting into it. So, and since baptism is the entrance door to get into this communio, you should realize before being baptized what it's all about. So Anabaptists will be one of our topics, and spiritualists will be one of the topics, and understanding their communio of believers, which transcended social and even gender hierarchies, and this needs to be regarded as a footstep in which evangelical communities of the 20th century actually were also walking. So we need the Radical Reformation for further understanding. That will be the second chapter, of course. And then we're doing it always in an experimentary way, in an experimentary look at the Anabaptist movement and their self-understanding. And then let's see what we can take from that. And thirdly, so we've got a few weeks to go. So thirdly, we will address a very special and a new form of evangelical communio, which can be traced back to the 16th century. Of course, almost everything can be traced back to the 16th century. And this is the communio of evangelical martyrs. This might sound a bit weird to have a communio of dead people. However, if you're talking about the idea of memory and the idea how memory actually shapes a group and forms a communio, it is highly important to talk about the martyrs, which are not very common in the evangelical movement. Not as common as in the Catholic Church, for instance, because they don't have the status of saints in the evangelical church. Nevertheless, throughout the 16th century, we have a huge amount of persecution of Lutherans and evangelical, and a huge amount of persecution of Anabaptists. So basically, the new evangelical martyrs are coming from the Anabaptist movement, and they put a very strong understanding of communio with the dead, between the living and the dead, into their practice, into their idea of communio. So this is probably a different form of communio, different from what you might expect if you're talking about communio, because usually you'd say, yeah, it's about the living and they're praying together, they're living together and so forth. But talking about martyrs will lead us to the point in which the visible and the invisible world in a way connect and see they form a huge communio as such. That so we do that in the third chapter, and addressing the culture of remembrance, that and their suggestion, to transcend earthly boundaries in a way. And fourthly, we will pack up everything we have learned from the 16th and 17th century, and we will jump straight to the 20th century in order to find out how the legacy of the Reformation era was put into practice when new evangelical orders arose. And we'll be doing this. While we are doing this, we will be having a tiny stopover, let's put it this way, a tiny stopover at the pietistic movement of the 17th and 18th century in order to pick up something what I would call the individual belief, or even the individualistic belief and inner healing, which seems to undermine the understanding of communio. So the idea behind this chapter is to say, look, faith becomes much more individualistic than it has ever been before. It's a very personal and individual, let's say, responsibility that goes along with it. And the question is whether this more individualistic understanding undermines the idea of group and the idea of communitarian religious life. And of course, the Lutherans, who are very strong into supporting the idea that the individual responsibility is very high, because you've got a direct connection to God himself, who very much support this idea, have to ask themselves what the relationship between individual faith and communitarian faith actually is, and how communio and individual are in a way interlinked or are related, or maybe there's no connection at all. So when we're moving on to the 20th century, then we will find out that the big break in between the understanding of communio, of course, in Germany, is the aspect of the National Social Democratic system, the Nazi regime, which sort of introduced a very perverted understanding of communio. And the fact that after the Second World War, communists like mine grew up is also an answer to the perverted understanding of communitarian life during the Nazi period of time, and saying we need to find or need to put something else into practice, a new understanding of communio. We need to put up something that is not perverted in that sense, but in fact is drawn towards life. So that's quite a huge chapter when we're moving on to the 20th century. I wonder if we make it in the times we are having, but for the moment, I'm really positive. And finally, you've got the time. The last term, I had to skip this a little bit, but I hope that in this term I can actually add it. I would like to introduce you to the category in research that tries to knit and net between various new and old forms of communitarian life. So this is quite fascinating because it's one aspect of the new forms that the ecumenical approach is very, very strong. So it's not restricted to the Lutheran Church and the Evangelical Church, but it also stretches out to the free churches, and it stretches out to the Catholic Church as well. So maybe we need to find a new category in communitarian life, and my suggestion will be in the very, very last chapter of our lecture here. My suggestion will be that the category of ecumenical friendship, is very, very important here, and we entertain this category at the very end because it can be understood as a prospect of unity to come. So basically, we are moving on from the past and maybe to the future, because if a church doesn't act in an ecumenical way in the future, then probably the church isn't a church anymore. So that's the understanding that lies behind it. So perhaps even newer forms of communitarian life derive from ecumenical friendship. Who knows? The unity which underlines the understanding of friendship might be enforced, like in Germany and the Second World War, by social developments like shrinking communities and their overaging. So there is a possibility and maybe also a necessity to find new forms of communitarian life, because the communitarian life as such, like in monasteries, changes a great deal, because it's sort of shrinking, and because people are getting older, and because of a few people just coming back, and because of coming up, and because of the fact that from a social point of view, maybe, and from a secular point of view, maybe these communions are not that great and exciting anymore. But still, it might also be issued by a new and deeper sense of unity, which leaves confessional boundaries aside and finds new ways of communitarian life in order to fulfill the common task. And it's still a common task God has passed over to various confessions, churches, and forms of life, and that's the task of unity, like in John 17, it was written down. So friendship in this sense of understanding, understanding each other as sisters and brothers despite origin or confession, is not only addressed by Pope Francis in his writing Fratelli Tutti, which I will mention briefly in the friendship chapter. It also relies on research of friendship coming from monastic theologians. Therefore, it might be helpful to plant this particular seed for further forms of monastic and religious life by addressing the power of ecumenical friendship, encouraging you as rising theologian to entertain this trace further for the future. So these are the five fields we will be walking on during the next weeks and over Christmas. It will be a journey, and at some place even, I guess, an adventure, especially when we're digging into the 16th and 17th century. And while walking this path, we will have plenty of time to listen to developments between the 16th and 20th century, but I would also like to encourage you to present questions whenever you have them. I think that's everything we need to say for that. So I guess we can start with the first big thinking about communion, just to give you a ground we can actually walk on. So before we jump into the 16th centuries, let us think for a moment about the relationship between individual belief and communitarian forms of evangelical movements and of belief and religious belief. So that's quite good, I guess, to ask some fundamental questions that arise in this context before we dig into this historical field. So these fundamental questions that arise in this context, which were already debated at the beginning of the monastic forms of life, have lost none of their topicality to this day. And this is the question, the big, huge question, how significant communio is in shaping individual spirituality. Do we really need forms of communitarian life? And do we need new forms of communitarian life? Or how do individual religious experiences and communio relate to each other? Because if the answer would be no, it's only the individual that counts, then sure enough, we don't need to talk about communio and new forms of life. But I will be arguing that there's a relation between both of them, and the individual needs the communio, and that's one of the reasons why new forms of communio are always necessary and are always put up. That's one aspect, and the other aspect is that the communio also needs the individual to get the inspiration needed for going on as a group and for going on in being a religious collective. So still the question is there a mutual exclusion or a mutual inspiration? And I would argue in the following, there's a mutual inspiration. Or is the experience of the individual perhaps highly necessary for the communio, which I will be showing, just as communio may be indispensable for the experience of the individual? I guess these questions are not only important in the beginning of monastic life and in the changing periods of time of monastic life throughout the 16th and 17th century. I also think that they are important for today, asking these questions of relationship, because today, at least in the evangelical field, in the Lutheran field, we have a lot of new, let's call them emergent spiritual communities that are coming up, and we have a lot of movements like the Catholic Church had throughout the 19th century. We have a lot of movements such as the houses of prayer movement, means that different houses of prayer pop up in big cities and sort of collect a large number of especially young people doing something like 24/7 prayers, and also providing some very strong senses of ethic perspectives, which might be too tight to some extent, but nevertheless, it's a movement. We also have a lot of young communities, young forms of communio coming up, at least in the Western European parts, that offer and provide a more or less unifying collective. But they do understand this more in the sense of a, let's call it, post-traditional, and therefore as a new form of communio. So they are actually saying, look, what the big churches have done, this time is over, and we are providing something new, a collective connected by prayer and of course the structure they are giving themselves. And well, research is not too much into this. We're still trying to find out why this is so attractive, especially for young people. So what I'm saying is that the question of individual belief, and we are in a pretty individualistic society right now, the question of individual belief and collective belief, the question of individual belief and communio are not only crucial in the early modern period and in the 20th century, but even today. So for today, we can say that one's own individual experience of faith is located in a semi-public space and it's regarded as so crucial, and that communio as such sometimes appears to be only indirectly significant, and if at all, in the sense of a vehicle. I need this group to work on my own faith. And the question is whether this is right or not, because that would mean one's own individual experience of faith would be the most important thing of everything. So more precisely, what it said today from this point of view is that the communio's function is sometimes exhausted in providing the space and the atmosphere in which the individual can make essential experiences for himself or herself in order to optimize himself or herself in spirituality. And if we follow this line, then we will come up with the idea that communio as such, in fact, is just a vehicle, and that the individual spirituality is the main focus. But in the end, however, communio does not appear to be essential for them. It's just the individual. It just provides the room for a special moment in time to serve the individual. And I wonder if this is correct. The communio just needs to serve the individual. This observation, however, fits in with talking of a plural and at the same time liquid society in modern society in the sense of Zygmunt Bauman and Martin Schüssler, two theologians, and one sociologist and one theologian, in which even the individual experiences of the gospel becomes through a growing liquidity tolerance, that's how they call it, liquidity tolerance.
I read a lot about Zygmunt Bauman.
Okay, so you're an expert.
Because I wrote my first thesis on sociology.
Right.
Yeah, thinking about all you are saying about liquidity, how
Yeah.
can I say in English?
Yeah.
Liquidità sociale, social liquidity, come si dice?
Yeah,
In
I
English.
get that. Yes.
Fantastic, Bauman.
And then you might, but it's in German. Michael Schüssler, he's taking this on, and he's saying, look, even the gospel in a liquid society, even the gospel, reading the gospel is just an event.
Yeah.
Okay. Even the gospel, reading the gospel.
Sorry if I.
No. Just fine, just fine. It's even entertaining, I guess, for the others watching this later. Right. Okay. So I don't. We've got a saying in Germany. It's called "carrying the owls to Athens," and that means don't do something in vain if the people already know. So we skipped Sigmund Baumann, and I'd like to address your interest towards Michael Schüssler. He's a German theologian, and as I said, he's also working on this liquidity tolerance thing, saying, as I just said, even the reading of the gospel might be just an event, and it's an event because in a liquid society, you don't have a linear understanding of time and of belonging. You're just there for the moment, and then it's pretty situational and not located in a binding communio, even if you read the gospel and know about the tradition it actually carries. So he argues if this is the religious state of mind, then it also affects the understanding of communio because it highlights the individual a great deal. And this is not a bad intention of the individual, but rather it reflects the social situation the individual is situated in. So, but my point is not to sort of play off the individual religious experiences against the communio, in order to speak in this way of an, let's say, an experience cleans a tradition of a communio or a dogma. This is not my point. The opposite is the case. I strongly believe that it is necessary to accentuate the interplay between solitary and common search for meaning in the footsteps of religious theology. And this is pretty important to me, the interplay between solitary and common search for meaning in the footstep of religious theology, in order to make clear that locating the individual in a binding communio has, in the best sense, a corrective effect. It has a corrective effect and therefore serves the individual biographies of faith. And if in the following chapter we're moving on to the 16th century, I guess it can be shown here that that communio and even new forms of communio have a corrective effect on the individual and therefore serve the individual biographies. Therefore, and I like to put this thesis forward, I'd say a binding communio offers a valuable contribution to the spirituality of individuals. It's a valuable contribution. This insight, I guess, is helpful not only for shaping and judging the present upheavals and of churches, denominations, and individuals' search for meaning, because it points to the fact that lived means vivid communio provides an elaborate frame of reference which in the best sense serves the discernment of spirits. And I guess this is what it's all about today, serves the discernment of spirits and thus helps to come to decisions by shaping the individual's spiritual life. So in order to clarify this interplay of individual experience and communio in the sense of this thesis, I would like to add some insight from the monastic theology of the Middle Ages and late Middle Ages and reflections of religious as well as religious rules of all denominations from the beginning of monasticism up to the present. So I would like to take an exemplarily view and will examine them with regard to the coexistence and or opposition of solitary and common search for meaning, and I guess that will give you a good ground to walk on when we're heading off to the 16th centuries. But let me explain this. Why did I choose this way to walk you into the question of solitary and common spirituality and its very specific forms of communitarian life? The answer is, I believe that religious rules, like monastic rules, offer a great basis for this because they are not only normative. They don't only say you have to do it like this and that, but they also reflect in a very condensed way the conditions in a binding communio living together while still dignifying the individual. So they are not only normative, but they tell us something about the fact how binding communities live together and how they work on the relationship to the individual. So to be more precise, they are equally concerned with individual religious experiences as well as with the possibilities and limits of communio. And this is very important when we're talking about new forms of communio as well. So what they're actually marking and underlying is tension, the tension between the possibilities and the limits of communio concerning the individual. But this tension also provides the opportunity to constantly reflect on the form of communitarian life. Does it, for example, does it require a renewal? And what happens if new aspects are added by new members? So if everybody has to move. And against this background, it is clear that the choice of rules used here is determined by the intensity with which they address communio, because not at all times it was equally important to ask questions about the relationship between individual and common search for meaning. And I wonder what reason we find for this. So the importance of communio for the solitary search for meaning, or the solitary phase of spirituality, you add the term you wish to add. The importance of communio for this search can hardly be overestimated, and yet it was and is only popular at certain times. This, I guess, refers to the rather wave-like formation of communal structures and the so-called intensive reflection on them in monasticism, in monasteries, at Luther's so-called third places we will address later, that collects the willing and the praying, like the waves in pietism, in communities of semi-religious people as we discover them in the Catholic tradition, like Mary Ward or Angela Merici, in deaconess communities and Protestantism during the 19th century, in secular institutes of the 19th century in the Catholic Church, or even in Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Finkenwalde Seminary, and that brings us back to the Lutheran Church. This seminary has been set up during the NS regime, offering theologians the chance to live and pray together in order to undermine the NS regime by setting up one's own structure of communio. So we even got a revolutionary potential in thinking about communio. So as you can imagine, this project has failed and was quickly shut down by the officials of the Nazi regime. Now it is clear that new communities and new forms of communio have become established, at least for a certain period of time, when there have been major upheavals in the states, particularly social hardships, or a growing need for new forms of spiritual life, and thus major changes in the church. The Protestant Church we are addressing in this part of the lecture, the Protestant Church is also part of this development. It is part of the change due to the change in context and due to the change in the surrounding of it. For example, the recognition of Protestant religious congregations like my community after the year 1979 initially went hand in hand with realizing that a new and almost revolutionary need for spirituality had arisen in the midst of the church, which apparently could no longer be fully served by the congregations, by the parishes. So the change we're actually experiencing in the 20th century, in the late 20th century in the Lutheran Church, is the idea there's a huge need for spiritual guidance, a huge need for spirituality, and at the same time, we have the understanding that the parishes and the priests and the pastors cannot fulfill this wish, cannot fulfill this desire. Instead, the focus was now on locations of grace. That's how they call it, on locations of grace where spirituality was not only a topic, but also was lived out in a sustainable way. So people were looking for places like monasteries, forcing them to find a new language for spirituality and forcing them to rehearse their understanding of communio, because they needed it, because people needed these places. Henceforth, evangelical orders or communities like mine were regarded as such places because they set, and this is a quote, they set a radical sign for life in the face of another reality. So people thought this is the place to be because it's setting this, the room for understanding a different, maybe an invisible reality. This sign was desperately needed in the late 20th century, and the monasteries, the Lutheran monasteries, fulfilled these desires and they still do because they still exist. The observation that the longing for and the shaping of communio precisely returns in precarious situations of upheaval suggests that communio should be understood as the basic code of Christian culture of life, because when life is needed, communio comes up again. So the basic code of Christian culture of life, in the sense of the Capuchin and Catholic theologian of religious orders, Ludger Schulte. He's a German theologian and even a monk. For it is precisely in communio, according to Schulte now, that the space opens up that shows, and now I quote him, what the Christian faith is all about. And in these moments of upheaval, when new forms of communion show up, then he says, and here it's sort of disclosed, it's absolutely disclosed what the Christian faith is all about. And it is precisely this that was and is needed and, as it were, actualized in precarious situations. So we do have a change in forms of communio and understanding of communio, that's my thesis, especially in precarious situations. Of course, we can now easily draw the conclusion that a spiritual answer of communitarian life needs to change with the circumstances given. If during times of upheaval, the communities do not care about the social and cultural environment they are placed in, they would not provide an answer to the needs of the time. And this is their job, provide an answer to the needs of the time. Therefore, the communio is destined to die. This means that renewal should be the constant battle to fulfill the task, orders, and any kind of religious communio are sent to do and to provide. It is the job, and this is a non-confessional job, it is a job of every religious communio, and to fulfill the to jump into this constant battle of renewal and to fulfill in order to fulfill the task they are actually called to do. That goes along for the Catholic Church as well as for the Lutheran Church. If you stop, you will die. I guess that's something we can draw from the synodality from both churches as well. While the context thus provides the occasion for the foundation or actualization of a communio, according to Schulte, we heard him, the spirituality that is then carried out as an expression of Christian culture of life is primarily based on its reconnection to God. That's his point. It's primarily based on its reconnection to God. God, is understood as an ingredient of mutual dependence and is thus conceived as communal and communio founding in itself. So in precarious time, you look at the Trinitarian God and say, look, this is the basic understanding of community and communio which is provided here. And for this very reason, communio is destined to unity in diversity and to diversity out of unity. So following God and sort of sensing the Trinitarian understanding of God, which comes from digesting the sense of unity God is actually providing, leads you to the insight that every communio is destined to unity and diversity and to diversity out of unity. In this, however, the difference between God and human beings is not abolished. Of course, it would be worse if this has been abolished, but rather unity arises from participation in the common. That's the idea. Unity arises from participation in the common. This is, I guess, an amazing way of describing God. And at the same time, it marks a very ecumenical position, which has also found its way into Protestant religious rules We may take a look or take it as an example by looking at the religious rule of the Fraternity of Christ, the Christusbruderschaft of Selbitz. This is a rule from the year 1999. So coming from a Catholic background, a rule from the year 1999 is not pretty old. Nevertheless, it's a Protestant rule addressing a religious order within the Lutheran Church. We'll come to this later, but in this rule, it is emphasized that the triune God is indeed the reason for the unity of the communio as such, and God calls out of himself to the acceptance of diversity. So that's basically his call. He calls out of itself to the acceptance of diversity, and from this, the ecumenical basic mission of a communio arises, stating that communio constantly needs to renew itself while keeping an eye on its ecumenical partners in faith. So again, we've got the idea that we are not talking about new forms of communio as an accident or something that, well, just happened, giving in answers to the context, the historical and social context we're actually in, but we are talking about this as a necessity. We're talking about renewal as a necessity for communio. So it's not, let's put it very simple, it's not bad if communio renews itself and changes itself. It's rather helpful, and it's the point to sustain the communio in the very end. Nevertheless, communio is not set as an ontological quantity, so it needs a constant renewal. It's not an ontological quantity. On the contrary, it is and remains changeable and renewable. That's the point. It is and remains changeable and renewable because it is always the product of concrete interest. It's always the product of concrete work of its members. And this work with and on each other arises when members understand themselves not only by their reference to God, moreover, they should see each other as people naturally striving for communio, while this process and striving is accompanied by interest, by powerful interest, and by ways to consider them and deal with them. So we've got two aspects. We've got the gift of communio by the triune God, who he itself, within itself, is unity and communio as such. And we've got the understanding, and that's my premissa, we've got the understanding that we as humans are sociable and that we need each other. And that we are looking at the triune God and see that, okay, that's the way it can actually work. It's a basic understanding of humankind that we may need each other. Nevertheless, as soon as we encounter each other, as soon as we approach each other, we've always got the question of power and power relations. And we always got the question of hierarchies and of settling these power relations and finding out who is actually first, who is second. I guess this is an ontological quantity, and then communio as such is a very changeable and renewable expression of this. Well, the fact that every relationship in different terms, but nevertheless in the last instance is a relationship based on power and hierarchy becomes, I think, quite apparent while looking at the life of communio. One may state that Christians should know it better, that they should, leave the powerful relationships and hierarchies behind. In fact, they do not do this, as Pope Francis has stated in Fratelli Tutti, when he mentioned that being a Christian does not mean to live the Christian way. And I like this term very much because it's very much down to earth, honestly, and it tells us a bit not only a bit, it tells us a lot about the understanding of the individual which he or she offers to the understanding of communion. So in Fratelli Tutti, let me quote this again, Pope Francis states that being a Christian does not mean to live the Christian way. And we have to keep this in mind when we're talking about communion. Now, this understanding of communion and power and hierarchy suggests that the relationship between communion and the individual should always be seen as a relationship full of tension in a way. So we're talking about tension. After all, here two significant quantities come together in order to recognize and to interpret meaning of faith and life. So we're talking about existential issues. Interpret meaning of faith and life, and to derive insights and actions from it in an obligatory way. And indeed, medieval monastic orders, as well as monastic communities of the present day, were and are not immune to the fact that the actually desired we, what's all about, the actually desired we they need and provide can quickly become a theological ideology that lets the individual sink in the we and thereby getting lost. So no community is immune against the fact that the we, the us, becomes very, very huge, and it sort of sucks in, and the I, the me, in order, to place this we and the us right above the I's head, if you want to put it this way. And then the individual gets lost. And I guess this is one aspect that comes into play when structures beat the idea of renewal. So in Germany, we've got a saying and it says, it's always been like this. It has never been different. So as soon as you use this saying, you sort of dignify the structures, and you sort of dignify the hierarchy that has been set, and you sort of skip the renewal and the potential of renewal of a communio. And of course you can do this, but I guess this will end up in a revolution. Because if you put something down for a very, very long period of time, then you don't have to be shocked when it explodes. Because at some point it will explode. I'm pretty sure about that. Now we've got these two quantities. We've got the individual and we got the communio, and we've got the danger that the us sucks in the individual. But just as little is the danger of the late modern talk of individualization. So we've got two sides to the coin, two sides of the problem. And the problem on the other side is setting one's own experience of faith as absolute. That's dangerous as well, setting one's own experiences of faith as absolute. This needs to be dismissed, since it possibly trivialized the we, the us. So if I do think that my experience is the one and only thing to be, then there is no us and there is no we. The cohesive forces of a communio, its competence in communications and its competence in conflict management and in the strategies of managing conflicts, therefore must be well developed in order to prevent or contain the strengthening of such exclusion or exclusive mechanism, let's put it this way, and ultimately of power struggles. So communio actually has to be very strong to fight this battle between the individual, or to work on this tension between the individual and the communio as such. If communions are not doing this, a communio can neither fulfill its function in order to inwardly, nor can it provide its service outwardly. And it would then be no help for the individual's search of meaning. So what I'm saying is that we do have this tension, and I'm saying that is absolutely necessary to work with this tension, because if communities, no matter of old or new forms, don't work with that, then they can't fulfill their job. And their job goes into their group, establishing a sense of unity. And they also got an outwardly bounded job, like living up to the calling of, bringing peace and reconciliation, working on all this. So it's a major task to work on about this tension, and if renewal in this case is not put into practice, any religious communio or even church will be lost. I'm pretty sure about this. It will be sure if you don't walk on, you just fall over in a way. The reference to and tension between individual and communio was already addressed in early monasticism and clearly in the monastic theology of the Middle Ages. Both state how important it was and still is to keep an eye on it. More precisely, already in the late antique Syrian monasticism, there was the position that God used religious events such as the spectacle of a column Saint Simeon to gather individuals, in this case the harmless in faith, and to counteract their inertia on the path of faith. Whoever criticized this with reference to a lack of sustainability in faith and to the idea that an event cannot support a sustainable faith, since the individual experience of faith finds no lasting concreteness in the communio, could and should be dismissed as what he called a grumbling spoon. In short, this unique experience of the individual related to the individual, and thus also the event was needed. That's the point. So you see, it's kind of tricky. We can't, throw off the individual experience, and we can't throw off the religious event, even of today's time, where the individual faith is sort of supported, and we can't throw it off by saying, look, there's no communion coming up. No doubt about this. However, stating this should not, or let's put it in a nutshell, all this should not marginalize communio. On the contrary, the need for communio should also be strengthened. This is also said in the monastic rules of the Middle Ages, and there's much more to this. The individual experience should be embedded into communio to fully come to life. And this is a huge and important sentence. The individual experience should be embedded into communio to fully come to life. Nevertheless, the experience and thus the desire for further experiences should always precede the embedding into the communio. Anything else, so this position can be sharp, anything else would be in danger of the I being submerged by the theological ideology of the we. And this should not happen. Individuals and individual belief had to remain free. And this is very Lutheran. It had to remain free. Instead, communion needed to be on the move. It had to keep in mind that it constantly had to walk the path of renewal. And this addresses its structures as well as its theology. So the tense interplay between individual experiences and communio has been further considered and differentiated in the monastic theology following early monasticism. The medieval theologian and monk Father Bernard of Clairvaux was the inspiration for this in a very, very special way. The theologian Ulrich Köpf has elaborated Bernard's theology of religious experiences, and by doing this, thus placed a filled concept of experiences clearly before Martin Luther, who's been attributed to have turned experience into a constitutive object of theology. But well before Martin Luther, namely in the 12th century, Bernard has set up his concept of experience, of individual experience, following John Cassian from the 4th and 5th century, systematically arguing with the pillars of self-knowledge and knowledge of God. Both were essential to his concept, the self-knowledge and the knowledge of God. And for Bernard, religious experiences is exclusively a primary experience. That means it arises from an immediate contact and takes place in the interior, the inner self of the experience's subject, who experiences this experience as a counter experience beyond rationality. Therefore, the person getting involved into God's sphere is passive, very passive in experiencing and perceiving only the working, what Bernard calls the working of foreign power. So to make this process and clear, Bernard uses numerous metaphors of food and taste. And I think this is quite good to understand the religious experiences, metaphors of food and taste. Thus, he is concerned with the taste of the inner experiences, with the digestion of what has been experienced and the pleasant smell of what has been absorbed. All this makes it clear that religious experiences in this diction is a deeply individual experiences, even if it arises from the action of a counterpart, God, and possibly leads to communitarian life because it needs the corrective force of the communion. The counterpart that gives rise to this experience, however, is perceived only in its effect, not in its full physical presence. This might sound a bit weird, but it tells us something about God's privilege to disguise himself. So God is experienced as a power, as something from outside, but still we cannot see him and touch him and do it like this. So what I have shown right now is that the individual experiences is important. And what I said right in the beginning, it is no good idea to play off communio against individual. And I guess when we're talking about new forms of community, we always have to keep in mind how important the individual aspect is and the individual, the personal religious experiences. Basically, this is one of the points we can say this is the ground we're actually walking on. Still, we've got the triune God as a mere sense of community and living together, and we've got the call to unity, and we've got the religious orders and their rules and their orders telling us how important it is to move on as a communion. So I may stop this PowerPoint right now and we take a little break until next week and dig deeper into this matter.
Okay, so I'm gonna maybe contact other students of these lessons so I can tell them that started your lessons.
Right.
Maybe someone forgot because it's very